And if you're just joining us, this is The Road to Racial Justice, a personal, congregational, and community journey. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Michael Terry, convener for the Board of Cooperative Ministries. We are in the third week of our premier virtual leadership focus conference. More than 150 Moravians from at least 65 different congregations, churches, agencies have registered this year. And so far, we are just about to reach 400 unique logins. 400 devices have logged on to the 12 live sessions which have taken place so far. Leadership Focus 2021 is an interprovincial event co-hosted by the Board of Cooperative Ministries in the Moravian Church Southern Province and the Healthier Congregations Task Force in the Northern Province. Know that your friends and colleagues in ministry still have time to register for our closing session this Saturday with Ben Ingebretson, Director of Church Planting and Emerging Ministries for the Moravian Church Northern Province. To register for Saturday session, I believe it's at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, you can simply log on to moravianbcm.org. Right now, as you've probably noticed, you're all muted, but you'll have an opportunity to share shortly. If you have any comments or questions meanwhile, especially during the presentation, please do type them into the chat box. Please join me now in welcoming two pastors, one from the Northern Province and one from the Southern, as they share their perspectives and respective stories, that is, of building congregational capacity to study, learn, and engage in racial justice, a very important conversation today. The Reverend Amy Gohdes-Luhman is pastor of Waconia Moravian Church in Waconia, Minnesota, where she works with the Racial Justice Leadership Council, along with Dr. Tim Berry, their racial justice consultant. Sister Amy is also part of the Racial Justice Task Force of the Northern Province. Also joining us, the Reverend Dr. Neil Routh is pastor of Grace Moravian Church in Mount Airy, North Carolina, and serves as a member of the Moravian Church Southern Province team for racial, cultural, and ethnic reconciliation. Thank you both, Amy and Neil, for joining us today. I'll go ahead and start off by inviting Amy to begin. Thank you so much, Amy, for joining.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the invitation. Looking at some of the faces I recognize, and some are new to me. Some have heard portions of the story that I'll share with you, and some have not. So I welcome questions, as we said in the chat, and time to answer those together as a group. So I'm just going to work our way through this PowerPoint and share the story of the work of racial justice ministry in white rural spaces and the work that's been happening specifically at Waconia. So this is not Waconia. This is DeForest, Wisconsin, and a picture by Kurt Liebnow that I really like. And so I thought that looked nice to open. It's also the church where I grew up, with my father being the pastor, Bob Gohdes, there. So the next slide is actually Waconia Moravian Church, where I've been serving since 2011. The story starts in May of 2013, so a little less than 2 full years that I was pastoring here, though I grew up in Carver County at Chaska Moravian Church, not far from Waconia, so I know the people, and they knew me, and they knew my dad, and so we have a good foundation of a relationship with each other as a church. But May of 2013, we're going to go to the next slide. This email came across my computer, and this is only a portion of it. It was 4 pages long, but here you can get at least a little bit. I'll read it. You are proud to be black, brown, yellow, and orange, and you are not afraid to announce it. But when we announce our white pride, you call us racists. There's nothing improper about this email. Let's see which of you are proud enough to pass it on. Be proud to be white. So this email comes across in the morning of in May, and I think to myself, well, I hope this just went to me. It, like I said, 4 pages and much worse content than this, characterizing Black people as criminals, using the N-word. This email went to members of the Joint Board, and it was from a member of the Joint Board. And so I quickly realized that this sort of reverse racism was alive and well in the church. And so the reactions varied. What happened was we understood we had to engage this. I'm going to go to the next slide. So what happened was a joint board meeting was called. I had a lot of coffees with the joint board members and just a deep sense of what the heck, what am I supposed to do with this? The reactions varied from let's excommunicate this joint board member who would send such a racist email to others who said, yeah, I see these, I just push delete. Well, it became clear as a joint board that pushing delete with this kind of racism happens way too often. And even me, my first initial response that if I could avoid this in any way, that would be great. If it had only gone to me, I could have had a private conversation with this person, shared why I thought this was such a bad email and such. But you can't just push delete. And I'm glad that my joint board was healthy enough not to do that. So that's 2013. We met, we talked about racism, all of us sort of uneducated in it, trying to help each other along. And then it fell into a sifting period. We'll go to the next slide. It wasn't until July 2016 when Philandro Castile was shot, 45 minutes from the church and a mile from my house. I live in St. Paul and commute to Waconia. My husband teaches in St. Paul. So less than a mile from my house, Philandro Castile was shot by an officer at a traffic stop. And it was his 57th traffic stop, not because he's a bad driver, but because he always looks like somebody that should be stopped. But this ended in his death. And that was a point where both the congregation members and the joint board members and myself were sort of like, oh no, we have to do something. We had a prayer vigil. We called the sheriff and asked him to come in from our Carver County and talk to us about police and how this all works and what he was doing with his own crew as far as education and such like that. And so we did some more preaching on the topic, and some of our people wanted to write a letter to the editor and did. Not everybody signed it, but some wanted to just get the conversation out there in our own community, which is a small rural / bedroom community outside, third ring, not a suburb, so a small town outside the Twin Cities. But we wanted to get it in our local paper and just talk about things like white privilege and things we were just starting to understand. And so we did that. And then the next slide, I ended up figuring I needed a lot of help. And so my idea was I'm going to hire an expert, an expert in implicit bias and white privilege, because we're a predominantly white community. And so I figured in the conversation about race and racial justice, we need to talk about whiteness. So I'm just going to get, a speaker to come in. We'll do a big promotion, we'll invite the community and our church, and then we'll be fixed. That was my hope. Well, the expert who I talked to said she wouldn't come anywhere near us. She was like, your church and community is not ready for what I have to say. And so I said, well, you supposedly work with faith-based organizations. And so tell me somebody you've worked with so that I can find out how I have to get to that point. So she pointed us in the direction of First Unitarian Church in Minneapolis, still a predominantly white church, but in the city. And they were a church who had determined they were a racially just church, which is what we wanted to become. So you can go to the next slide. So I called the person who was on the lay person who was the chair of their racial justice team and asked if she'd meet me for coffee. She said yes, and 4 hours later, had literally given me every single thing she could ever think of from the past 4 years. They had been working toward the point at which they could say we're a racially just church. 4 years of doing the 3-hour PBS series, Race the Power of Illusion. And so we just took everything that she gave us and just did everything like she told us to do that they had done. We created adult learning things with book studies. We did this PBS series for the congregation first to test it out, then for the community. Then we teamed up with a Lutheran church because they're bigger and have more people. They had a nicer sound system at that point than we did. We have a nice one now. Thank you, COVID. And so we teamed up with the Lutheran congregation, and then we invited the city council and the mayor, and then we offered it 6 times over 2 years, just offered the same exact thing that she had scripted for us. We offered it over and over and over and over again, ranging from attendance from 20 to 32 people about a time. And then, like they did, we created a racial justice leadership council. This is 6 members, 3 men, 3 women, different age groups, different circles of influence in the congregation. Some of them led book studies, different groups led book studies, existing groups like the adult Sunday school decided to do one, the women's book group decided to take on a racially just book. We did some cultural outings, plays, various things that were available in the cities, other learning opportunities. And we did a congregational listening session. And that was, what that was we had a family that had adopted children from Asia, she talked about the children's experience in the school system. We had another family who had an adopted child from Haiti, and they talked about his experience. And then we have one gentleman who's Black and in our congregation, very light-skinned, and he talked about his growing up in North Minneapolis and then his experience in Waconia. And so those were pivotal points when people that in the congregation that are known share their stories that people had not heard about around racial justice. So those were some things that we did, but you see it was 2 years, 2016 to 2018. We can go to the next slide, 2018. So now people know that, and by people, I mean the congregation, like at all levels, knows that this is something we're interested in, racial justice. We hadn't made any declarative statement or resolution yet, but they all sort of knew. So one day I come into my office, and in the period of the first half hour I'm there, I get 3 phone calls. Well, I think it was 1 phone call and 2 emails. They were all members of the Rotary, the local Rotary Club. And they all called me and said, you have to call Dr. Tim Berry. You have to call him. He's the one who can help us. And so what had happened was Dr. Berry is a local resident, and he had been asked by the Rotary to share his story that morning, a Wednesday morning. And he shared his story, and 3 of my members were there and said, you need to call him. Well, I had never met him, but I called him. And from there, we hired him as a racial justice consultant. So somebody who would work with the racial justice, and it was actually the Racial Justice Leadership Council was formed after he was hired. He kind of directed us how to do that. And began to work with us, that Racial Justice Leadership Council. And so it was from there that we started offering trainings in critical race theory, not something I can do, but something Dr. Berry can certainly do. And we have a lot of teachers and administrators in our congregation. And so it became clear the way to get people to come is to offer credit for the educational units, CEUs. And so we were able to figure out from the Minnesota Department of Ed how to get those for administrators. And we had an administrator in the school system, so we could get those for teachers. And so we put it on our Facebook, we shared it with our own congregation in the community, and then we had the carrot, of the CEUs. And so those were well attended. We did the first one in-house. We didn't tell anyone we were doing it, just congregation members. We didn't have CEUs for that one, just to kind of test it out. And that went well. And so then we opened it up to the community. And in the most recent one, or one of the second or maybe third community one, we specifically invited the school superintendent, who, like I said, we had members that worked with him closely, so it was easy to get to talk to him. And then the sheriff of Carver County, who I grew up next door to, so it was easy to talk to him as well. And so we specifically invited them, like, you guys need to be here. You're leaders in the community. You need to come to one of these trainings. They did. And also the city administrator. I had been having coffee with her, and she knew other people that were from our congregation. And so she showed up as well. So much so that the next time we offered the very same thing, the sheriff and the city administrator ended up funding it. They paid for it, and they brought the sheriff brought all of his office, all of his administrative office with him. And quite a few of the city council members showed up as well. So that was great. And then COVID came, and we started doing it online. And that was in 2020. In 2019, once we had worked some through with Dr. Berry and with our Racial Justice Leadership Council, we created this resolution. We brought the resolution to the annual church council. And so and we had a discussion on it and voted on it, and it passed. But here's what it is. Whereas we acknowledge a crisis in our nation regarding systemic racism and oppression in education, employment, government, and our justice system. Whereas the results of systemic racism are fundamentally at odds with our Moravian polity and beliefs, and confronting racial inequity and oppression is essential for our Christian witness and spiritual wholeness. And whereas at the January 2018 Church Council meeting, the Waconia Moravian Church made a commitment to racial equity, resulting in the creation of a Racial Justice Leadership Council, which provides guidance for our racial justice work. Therefore, be it resolved that the Waconia Moravian Church publicly declares its commitment to no longer remaining silent about racial injustice in any context, and promoting racial justice through education, advocacy, critical reflection, and positive relationship building in our congregation and in our communities, and addressing structural racism, however it confronts us, through intentional efforts in our ministry as a church. So once this passes, then it makes everything easier. And so now it's 2020 and beyond. And as you all know, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, not far from the church, another about 45 minutes from the church. And so this conversation now has become a national conversation, and having that racial justice resolution pass makes it a lot easier to simply know this is ours to do. There's still a lot of education, even within our own congregation. So we'll be doing the PBS series again, and we'll keep doing that. That's just a great way to start, as well as the critical race theory workshops that Dr. Barry does. He's created 2 of them now, and we'll start with the first one and then work up to that second one again. So just a continuing cycle of learning, as well as other ideas that people come up with. And just to close, the latest one that people came up with is a children's anti-racism workshop. And so we did one in November, and we'll do one in April. It's just a couple of days, and it's just on a kid's level, how to talk about racism and how to be an ally and supportive of anti-racism. So that's where we are 2020 and beyond. And this I just have out there if we want to talk about this or not. I think this is just some ideas that I have found to be helpful in any church around any justice ministry. Just questions to ask yourself as a church leader, as a lay leader, as a pastor. What do you hear from God? What do you hear in Bible studies? What are you hearing from the pulpit? What are you hearing in your prayer life? Because any of these ministries, they need to come obviously from God. And then what does your community need that no one else, no other church or organization is doing? What are people talking about that seems like it needs fixing? What injustices are evident by all or most of the folk that you talk to? What resources does your congregation specifically have, and what are your circles of influence? And then what are your core values as a church? And finally, what is God saying for your specific church to do? Because not every church is going to have the same core values or circles of influence or resources. And so there are different things that God's going to ask different churches to do. I think that is what I have prepared, but I am very open to questions at any point on this, or Neil, if you were going to go and then we have questions, whatever way works best.
Yeah, why don't I do that? Because I'm not going to add a lot to what Amy said. In fact, I want you to know that the Northern Province team and the Southern Province team have started meeting together. We do that about quarterly or maybe a little more often. And in one of the things that helped with that a few years ago, I had a chance to go on behalf as a rep of our team with the Northern Province team to an experience in Montgomery, which is going to be replicated this fall. So for those of you able to do that with the Northern Province, please do that. It changes all of this as a pastor. What I want to add is this. So first of all, Amy's got the model. Please follow Amy's model. If you're looking at what this means in real time right now, I think this comes as close to perfect. I know Amy wouldn't say that. I'm saying that. But I want to tell you a different story. And so this story is going to take us back a little bit. My screens are super duper duper simple. So bear with me just a moment. I'm just going to show you a couple points that I want to make, and then I'm going to come out of the share screen. Hold on just a minute here. Okay, Here we go. So my story starts in 1996. I'm now at Grace Moravian the second time. In fact, in the last week, I've been at Grace Moravian in Mount Airy the same amount of time I was there the first time in the 90s. And I couldn't be more pleased to be where I'm at. I was in the middle of a doctoral ministry project in 1996, and it was one in which there's a series of projects you do with different groups in the congregation. And this is nearing the point where it's time to do like the dissertation or the main project. And part of how that came about was that last group came up with a cool idea. We love doing love feasts. Let's do a love feast with our church and a church that's Latino, Hispanic, and a church that's African American. You know, sounds like a great Moravian altruistic thing to do. And so as we began to research that, and again, this is an idea that came out of a group, not myself, we began to realize we needed to do some learning. And so as we did that, we discovered something about ourselves. It was as if we were trying to create some sort of intervention for people with a problem. And we had a bigger problem than the people we were trying to help. And it was around our understanding of what racism is, what white privilege is, what we say more often now is implicit bias. And so with the encouragement of the PDC president at the time, Bob Sawyer led me to a key civil rights leader in the area. And so this is a link to Amy's story where she got the local expert. Well, he came to Mount Airy and we began to build a team that had about 5 members of the congregation and 5 folk from the community. And together we were a diverse group that represented a lot of different expressions of life, African-American, white Moravians, even a Hispanic Moravian who is part of our church. And we began to look at the situation we were in. It reminded me today of something I would say from Teresa of Lisieux called the little way. So this is when you choose to do something that seems small at first, and it kind of finds you. It's not something you go out and say, hey, we're going to do this. So we had no interest in necessarily doing race work, but it found us. And what we confessed about each other was that we were struggling to understand racism, and that our friends of color that were part of this dialogue didn't feel particularly safe with us. And so we began to talk, and this became a project of a group within the church. It was not the church's project. It's something I want to be clear about, but the church gave us its blessing. And I want to say that to you because when you start small, and in this other province, there's a couple places where groups are starting in churches, the fact that you exist, the fact that you do your thing, can be a tipping point for the rest of the church in very positive ways. But trying to make the whole church go through this at once can sometimes be a bigger barrier than it needs to be. So our group started, we expanded the dialogue. We made sure that at least half the group represented people from the community who were not white and who had leadership positions and could teach us all in ways that we needed to learn. And we made sure that there was a sense of mutuality in how we did it. So after the civil rights leader from Winston, Carlton Eversley, led us in this initial training, and it took about a year to do. We met about every other week, sometimes once a month. We recognized we had one model we had all been through in Mount Airy, and it was a course that used to be taught by the Chamber of Commerce, of all things, called Leadership. In this case, Leadership Mount Airy. And it's a model where you find a topic. Each of us just figured out what was the most emotional, important topic. You know, for me, was Moravian history. And by 1998, a lot of really important things were being done in the Southern Province around the Southern Province story of slavery. Others picked things like redlining and housing or public education, just a whole bunch of public health, a lot of different things. And here's the point. We each picked a topic. We did a deep dive on that topic enough that we could come back and teach the group about that topic. So all of us weren't trying to learn all the topics, but we learned one well enough to teach the others. And that provided a powerful model for how to be a group for each other. So my point is, in our case, the dialogue itself was what was most crucial, not the outcome. And the result was a mutual discovery within our relationships. We created a safe place that was an authentic space where people of color could talk to people of whiteness, of what it's like to be in the Mount Airy community, to be literally in Mayberry. And it was a powerful thing. So this is my last screen. Today, one of our current resources, it's very, very powerful, is by Jameer Tisby, called The Color of Compromise. And he makes this powerful statement about, we all want to jump to reconciliation. And my thing that I notice is white people particularly, we just want to fix this and move on. Our congregations typically talk in those tones. But before we can do that, we can get reconciliation. We need to recognize there's something that comes before it. So he offers these 4 steps. Before there's reconciliation, there has to be repentance. Before there's repentance, there has to be confession. Before there's confession, there has to be truth. So once you think about what Amy just shared with you in that powerful story from Waconia, you can see how those 4 elements came together. They're not necessarily stair steps. They don't necessarily, one comes before the other, because the other, in many ways, they happen simultaneously. But notice there's 4 things going on, not just reconciliation. And for folk that are not aware how their sense of truth has an implicit bias to it, it makes the confession stuff very difficult. But when we start to see that, it takes a lot of empathy and energy to facilitate really profound confession, repentance, reconciliation work. In my story in Mount Airy, some of those folks went on about 5-6 years later to be members of the provincial team. And there's 2 people on our team that are from that original group in Mount Airy who were not Moravian. They're community members. They're now that remain with us. It was later when our province started looking at these issues in 2006 that some of us stepped up and said, hey, we worked on this in our church to a point. It was more of a dialogue group and not an action group like Amy's been able to pull off, but we want to learn more. And so a core of us, along with others in the province, started that team that's now been in existence since 2006. But to be completely transparent with you, I'm going to get out of stop share. The bulk of what we've done since, I'm going to say 2017, far outweighs what came before it. And I'll end with this, but it took the work of a small group in a church that worked for the better part of about 2.5 years to be the foundation so something could happen provincially. It took that group working in very slowly for more than a decade to lay the foundation for what now is picking up a lot of speed. It all fits together. Every little thing you're doing, whether it's in your church, a friend group, whatever, matters. But I want to take you back to where I started. Teresa of Lisieux, I was reading about her recently. So we like to talk about Teresa of Avila. We don't talk about Teresa of Lisieux very much. And what's really curious about her is that she was a very minor saint person. She found out at a young age that maybe the thing that nobody else wants to do is the thing she could do. And in her case, it was being in a convent where she cleaned everybody's chamber pots and she washed the dishes and she ate the food that everybody else was going to throw in the garbage, because that was something she could do that was very simple, that helped the whole community. And because she was willing to do that little thing, it opened up things for others. And she began to see that we become love. She is the inspiration that led to people like Dorothy Day and Mother Teresa of Calcutta later on. I think this work follows that pattern. It is not an effort, particularly for us white folk, to be suddenly champions or heroes or to do something brave and big. It starts little. It starts with Amy getting that weird email and wondering what in the, what are we going to do as a board, but talking through it honestly. Or me as a group in Mount Airy when we were thinking about this really cool love feast and realized, wait a minute, we can't do that if we recognize we got some issues we need to talk through, and we engaged a multi-year process of discovery. So pick the little way. and let it carry you forward. And be sure as you do it, you try to include as many diverse voices as you can, and see what God can do. So I'm going to back off of what I'm saying so we can have more of a discussion at this point. So let's talk. Anybody, really. You get, and notice in your chat space that Ruth's put a lot of really good stuff there in the questions that Amy has mentioned tonight. So what are questions that, yeah.
I just wanted to ask Amy, what happened to the person who sent the email, and how did her church, what type of pushback did they have at her church, and how they handle that?
She was quite willing to meet with me, and shared honestly that she'd grown up in a racist household, as many people in Carver County do, and in small town northern cities do, or small towns in the north, and so she was honest. She also didn't really understand the level, nor maybe read the email as closely as she should have. But so what happened with the church was that she offered an apology to everyone that she sent the email to. She was part of the conversations at the annual meeting, and some of the conversations at the joint board level. So she was not kicked out of the church. And that would have been very difficult for the joint board to do that. So it was all sort of a sense of, oh, okay, we're gonna go forward this, and we're gonna learn together with this, and she was very open to me talking from the pulpit that this had happened, and I didn't openly say who sent it, but it was shared, and not only by other people, but by her. So she understood that she had started something. She had started a conversation, and I often told her, had you never done that, I would have avoided it. I would have avoided it, and that's a horrible thing to say. But it's absolutely true. I mean, maybe it would have come in some other way, but I sure wouldn't have started talking about it in 2013.
Yeah.
So she continues as a member.
I have a question, Mark. In our church, we had a committee that was very interested in social justice issues, and offered a couple of book studies and met regularly, and last month fell apart after 3 or 4 years. And I wasn't on the committee. I attended the book studies, but my understanding is they just, first of all, the committee wasn't of one mind on how to proceed. And secondly, they got such poor feedback from the rest of the congregation that they didn't feel motivated to move on. And that's where we sit right now. And then we have a member who was a member of that committee, and he's now gung-ho. He's got a big program, a four-cornered program, and he's recruiting people, and he wants to, and it feels scattered to me, but I also understand his desire to, I was just looking at my notes, what he was talking to me yesterday. He wants to have a group for social justice, a group that's going to be studying violence, and a group on community community impact, and a group on education. So I'd just like your feedback, Amy and Neil, on, you know, what that sounds like to you.
The thing that, and I was thinking about this a lot today, how this might go and what we might say. And one of the things I'm hoping that you hear is how much Amy's story is very much set in what's going on in the Waconia community. And that you hear me say, even though I served Mount Airy, went on to serve some other churches, came back to Mount Airy, it's got to match where you're at. And Carol, I hear that concern on your part. I'm way more concerned, where Amy's talking about this person that wrote this email. While that's terribly concerning, I'm more concerned with a person like you're dealing with, Carol, who wants to champion the cause of whatever and get everybody all jazzed up about it, because that's how implicit bias actually gets worse, because it has this self-righteousness to it, even if it's unintended. What I've learned from my colleagues of color and colleagues older than me and from outside the Moravian traditions has been that it's really important to talk from the edge of where you're learning and struggling, like but you don't know. I was thinking in Hickory, that's where I began ministry, and they were just beginning this conversation, and there were ministers at the end of their career at the front of it, and there was wonderful diversity there. And one day a group that was very white, didn't have any diversity at all, but they felt like they had cornered the earth on how to do this, showed up to tell the group how to do this. And one of the stately African-American leaders very graciously, I've never had this ability myself, said, I hear where you're coming from, I appreciate it. Have you actually done this yet? And we all knew what the answer was. And he says, it's cool. I would really like to hear from the people who haven't done it yet and are struggling on how to do it. So I say that to say I don't know that it's ever a safe space, when there's permission to discover relationship and then go at issue, you're going to get further. At Grace, we say we're always going to put relationship above issues. Now, sometimes that could be a cop-out because you never get to the issues. But if we're going to put issues first, we're probably going to blow up relationships. So it is an interesting thing, but it also means that it's going to be absolutely contextual and very different from church to church to church. But I want to be sure that people in the church I'm a part of are actually going at this together, rather than I'm coming at you or somebody else in the church is coming at us. So Amy, what's your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that last bit you said, that the church is doing it together as much as possible. That's why we continue with the power of illusion over and over, because people have joined, since then, that they know that this is important to us because they hear the preaching or they see things that are either our people or myself put into the newspaper. They know that we're offering trainings, but they all know but they don't know it because they haven't maybe done any of it yet. And so that's why we keep doing those and specific invites. It does help. I can tell you, having the Racial Justice Leadership Council be appointed by the joint board. So they're appointed by the joint board. And their work is literally, it's not housing. It's very localized on race and racial justice. And so it really helps to have those people set aside to do that work specifically. We did try to do like a social justice ministry, and we had 19 people show up, and they literally had 19 different ideas. And I was like, oh, I'm tired. I just want to go home. I can't even begin, It was nice to hear about everybody being excited about, hunger or, food to farm to table or, different stuff. But I couldn't get my head around it. And so I see what you're feeling, Carol. I think figuring out where your relationships are, I think you just said this, Neil, too, where your relationships are, where your connections are, and what is your thing, your maybe one thing to do. But having as many people buy into it as possible. They don't all have to be in leadership, for sure, for sure. You just want to get them to one thing.
I wanted to, but that's a question, but share something. We hear, and we heard the term a lot tonight, reconciliation. So I'm going to admit at very first, I don't know what that means. I don't know what reconciliation means. And we've got reconciliation teams, cultural, ethnic, racial. So I'm going to say that first, but a list, I was looking at your list, Neil, truth, confession, repentance, and reconciliation. A starting point is the truth.
Right.
That's both concrete, but also filled with emotion. There is a truth. And I've heard people tell stories, for example, about home church that are so far from what I know to be the truth.
Right.
So it leads me to say we're all coming from so many different places with this concept. I don't know what social justice means or looks like, but there is a truth, and that's truly a beginning point, so that people can build on a truth. The vocabulary that we're all using and assuming everybody else thinks or defines it just exactly as we do, if we're working together, that's something I think that's important, that we all are using the terms of this, and I call it a movement, so that we all understand each other. And I think, to me, this is a case where I participate in what I call some authentic things. I worship each Sunday morning with our Black church, Moravian church in Winston, which is the oldest Black Moravian, the only Black Moravian church in the United States, and it's the oldest in North Carolina. And it's an authentic. I love those people. I know them and work with them. So as I think Amy says, they're not asking us to do something to them or for them,
Right,
but with them. And we've had, and I'm a member and leadership with Church Women United, which is an authentic organization where we are all there for, just because we love and care for each other. And it's one of the most integrated experiences that you can imagine. So I think authenticity in what our relationships is so important, and having a good, strong beginning point for this, and having some idea of, and speaking to what Carol said, the goal. What is it that we want to be, so we can actually evaluate from time to time whether we're going in the right direction.
Yeah.
So I can get pretty passionate about this as well.
Let me, Peggy, let me dive in, if I might. One of the spots you bring up, and I'm just doing this to kind of, I find this in a teaching mode, sort of press things to an edge to give it definition, but I don't do so to change what Peggy's trying to say, or to say you have to do this in a particular way. Had a colleague just in the last week or so who's been with me in this journey we're talking about since 2006. And she's done a much better job at me in building close friends in her life that have a different ethnic and cultural upbringing than she does. And as we've lived through 2020, from what happened with the Floyd murder all the way up to recent weeks, it's grieved her, but her friends have been honest to say, you don't get it. And so I'll take you back to those 4 words about reconciliation, repentance, confession, and the truth. I think if, from a white perspective, we think we're ever going to get to this place where I get it, and we're all going to kind of do something with this topic, so we go on to something else, you don't get it. Because part of what I understand about this is to feel the pain and be able to sit in the pain and to listen to somebody else's thing. So I think about in our work, there's 2 movies that come to mind. One is one you probably hadn't heard of, called Traces of the Trade. It's put up by the Episcopal Church about 0809. Southern Province has a copy of it. You can find it at the BCM. And to watch that with members of St. Philip's, I was pastor at Christ Moravian at the time, and a group of us watched it together, and to be struck by everything in that film, but to also notice that you see the film differently based on whatever you've gone through in your life, and to allow space for all that difference to happen, but then to notice how different it must feel, because it's about slavery. If you're in St. Philip's story and the particular people that were in the room, and not trying to fix it, not trying to say I understand it, not trying to but to give presence to it and invite that conversation to take me somewhere I haven't been before. That's what we're talking about. What she was saying, my colleague was saying to me, is she still is burdened by pains that happened and being raised in the period of Winston-Salem when segregation moved back to integration, and it had pains. It happened to her in the middle of high school. So she lost relationships and things over that she's never gotten over. And so whenever these big cultural wounds happen, like George Floyd and other events in the last year, it takes her back to her own trauma and that she's not gotten through. And her friends of color are trying to talk about some present situation, and instead they end up trying to help her with her trauma. And they've said to her, we love you, but we ain't got no time for that. There's something bigger happening. So I just say that to say, as white people, we tend to burden the people of color to fix our trauma or to hold our pain or whatever. What I think Amy's saying, what I'm saying is we got to create a space where it is really messy. It is really spontaneous. It's real living and authentic and moving. It's not clean and systematic or anything like that. But Peggy, you're right. It starts in the truth, and maybe it begins with, I know part of the truth, but do I know all of the truth?
That's because our truth is not the same as theirs.
Yeah.
It's real simple. Our truth has nothing to do with the truth of the Black people in this country.
That's right.
I grew up in a small town in northern Indiana. Never went to school with a Black person in my life. I'm now 70 years old. I have 13 great grandchildren. 3 of them are mixed race. I have a niece who's got a son and daughter that are blood relation. She's as white as a sheet of paper, and he's as black as this screen. They drive in a car together through a neighborhood in St. Petersburg, Florida. And do you think the police are not going to stop them?
Right.
Their truth is not the same as ours.
Right.
That's right.
I'm sitting here in North Carolina, in one of the richest areas that I can think of, and realizing that in Forsyth County, we have one of the worst problems in the country. We have 25% of our children on the east side of Winston who are of color go to bed hungry every night of the week.
That's right.
We have to, I get very passionate, and I'm sorry about that, but it's a problem that we have to realize that we can't look at them and think, well, we know how to solve their problems. We have no idea how to solve their problems because we don't know what their problems are. Yeah. I've never been stopped from walking down the neighborhood and walking down the street, and yet by a policeman because I didn't look right. My nephew has. If we stop and think, we have a long way to go. And I like what Amy said at the start. This is not a short-term deal. You're talking 2, 3, 4 years of hard work before we can solve this. And the problem of it is right now in our society, after what has happened with the racism of the last 2 or 3 years, I grew up in Muncie, Indiana, and we had the race riots of the 1960s was in my high school. We made national news. Seeing that, folks, this might be our last best chance to get it right, because if we don't, it's liable to come completely unglued.
Mm-hmm. I want to make a resource. Some of you, it's Brownicity. I don't know if any of you know about this, but Lucretia Berry and her husband, and she is I'm going to use the word dark brown, and he is white. But they have a wonderful ministry, and she has ancestors who were slaves and are buried in the God's Acre, the Black God's Acre in Salem. But their whole premise is there's not, and this is what hurts me. We use the terms black and white, and I'm so awkward saying that every time I say it, but they're saying that everyone's a hue of brown.
Mhm.
And so that's why it hints brownicity. So he's very light brown and she is very dark brown. And their children are sort of medium brown. And immediately there's something sort of embracing about that concept that we're just hues of a color. And but they have a really bold and truthful ministry, and they're in Charlotte at this time. But she is from Winston-Salem, and it's Lucretia Berry.
I really appreciated, Neil, what you said about the little way. I think in my own anti-racism journey personally, like kind of learning from educators who give permission to say, you don't have to do it all. You're not going to learn everything you need to know today from an Instagram post. You're not going to read a book and be an expert. So I think that has been really helpful to me, not as a cop-out, but as a sustainability kind of focus, and I think that when I hear you talk about in a congregation, don't be know-it-alls, like start little, let your identity grow into that. Because I think sometimes the church, we struggle when we see a problem with not just getting out there and fixing it so that we can get on to the next thing. And I'm sure we can all think of ways that the church has done that better and the ways that the church has struggled with that. But what that really helps me think about, how do you introduce the concept of racial justice in congregations that maybe aren't thinking at all about it. Certainly picking up on the urgency of our world, Don, you're right. Like it's right there. And I think we do have a responsibility and obligation as Christians to pick it up and to do the work. But it's helpful to hear how other people are doing it, because I think it does feel like, isn't there just a model that will work for everybody? And I think the model, if there is one, is that you build it in relationship with other people. You listen, you learn, you make mistakes, you apologize, you work towards that. And I think the process of truth and reconciliation that we've had here in Canada with our Indigenous folks around residential schools is really only getting started, even though the process has ended. There's still so much truth to be dug up and so much for people to learn and to hold on to as we think, what is it that still lasts, the harm that was done in the name of people like me against people that don't look at all like me. So I just really appreciate the work, and I appreciate the two kind of lenses that have happened in both provinces. And I'm grateful to know that you're working together. I think that there's so much more we can do when we work together and support each other on the journey.
And I would say, if any of you who are attending this or see this later, have a chance to do some really good training. One of the ones in our area that I highly recommend is Crossroads Training. They're actually all over the country. Our team was trained by them years ago, and they continue to do work. Christy Kluwer is part of that, and a couple other leaders in our area. And one of the pieces that we use a lot is this. So think of personal prejudice, personal racism as P to the power of 1, P1. And when white people in general are in a congregation, we start talking about this topic, we're almost exclusively talking about that level. And you can talk about that till the cows come home. It will not change anything about systematic racial injustice. The next level is institutional racism or prejudice. And so that's P to the power of 2. It's 10 times more powerful than personal stuff. And so that's what will happen in a church. That's what Amy was tackling. That's what the group chose to work on. Now you're a parent and you just sent your kid to school and you raised that kid perfectly. But that school, because it's an institution, is 10 times more influential than you on what you taught your child, believe it or not. Then there's a societal or cultural racism, which is P to the power of 3, which is 100 times more powerful than you are. So when you want to look at the George Floyd stuff, when you really want to talk about justice stuff, you're almost always going at P2 level to bring about change. You can't do it at P3. It's so big. That's January the 6th. That's what that looks like. But P2 is different. But what will happen on a congregational level or white individuals is we'll say, we don't need to do that because I personally don't feel racist. That's not what P2 stuff's about. It's about having an education process like Amy talked about and engaging action like she talked about. So it's important to have some kind of language to work through this. Crossroads is just one of the ones. Because of Zoom, you can kind of pick and choose now what you want to do. The danger that Carol's talking about is when we think we've read some books and we can lead people without doing that real deeper level of education and understanding, particularly the difference between personal racism, institutional racism, and societal or cultural racism, because you really have to have different tools to approach them. Anyway, sorry for that tangent, but just want you to know that.
That was very helpful, Neil, and I love how you frame things. And Peggy, I want to get back to what you say. I don't know what reconciliation looks like either. We're not there. We're barely at repentance and confession. I think we're just really looking at truth still, and a lot of learning. And what you said, Peggy, about getting your definitions of words and concepts in order when you're talking about this and with the audience that you're talking about, that's where Dr. Berry is with us still. Okay, like we are still having to work on our definitions. I mean, we've got sin, racism is a sin. Like, that's been helpful to say that. But what's white privilege? What's systemic racism? What all of these definitions? So you're right on as far as the work, how slow it needs to go and how carefully it needs to go. At the same time, you just do everything you can, because as Don says, things are not right. They're just not right in the world.
I would like to respond to what Neil said about you can read a bunch of books and think you know it all and want to go in and do something or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I have been reading like crazy. I was a major history teacher, and right now I'm reading The Road to Equality. And I'm not coming out of it that I know now what to do. I'm coming out of this like, holy mackerel, how come I never knew this crap?
Right.
I mean, and it is, to me, what's most upsetting is I know what I learned in elementary school and high school and college. And it wasn't even the whole truth. I mean, they just conveniently left out all Black history, for goodness sake. And so I think, I read because I need to know the stuff, but it's not giving me the answers so how to fix it, because it is just it's really overwhelming. It really is.
There's the one lately, I like to throw books out. My colleagues hate me for that, I suppose. Charles Blow, The Devil You Know. And after being in Montgomery, and those of you who get a chance to go to Montgomery, you'll know what I'm about to say. When you meet Brian Stevenson and anything Brian Stevenson's got going on right now with EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, if he says this is the most important book to read, I'm going to read it. So that's the book. And Charles Blow is talking, this is the most recent analysis of what just happened since last March. He is a writer for the New York Times and an independent journalist himself. But anyway, last summer, when there was Black Lives Matter protest, does it surprise you that 70% of the people that showed up to do the protesting were white? Mm-hmm. Does it surprise you to know that there were also millennials? Does it surprise you to know that something not that they did something wrong, but it lost sight of itself when they got pushback from police and others and got offended, that it became about how offended they were, and it stopped being about the Black lives that they were trying to make matter. And that's what tends to happen with white compassions, and I use that word facetiously. We want to help, we want to do the right thing, we want to make it right, but as soon as it gets hard and we get offended, we make it about what we're offended about. I put a more finer point to it. When you're on that justice team like Amy's got going on, and some of you have in your church, and it gets hard because there's people will push back, it's real easy for white men and white women to suddenly make the focus of ism, some ism that you feel a victim of. We've had that struggle in our own justice team in the Southern Province. And if you know that's going to happen, then like Carol's saying, it makes you more open to, oh, this is going to be a road of brokenness, and it's going to break me in ways I don't anticipate. And I've got to be sort of okay with that. So I want to travel with some people I can do brokenness with. And I feel safe in my brokenness with them. And what's going to happen is something on the other end that is God. I do say, for Peggy's sake, 2 Corinthians 5, 17 and 18. I think it's the heart of the gospel. Paul says, and this is the whole point, that we are now partners with Christ in the mission of what? Reconciliation, reconciling the world to God. There's your reconciliation word. And so I would say that includes racism, that includes sexism, that includes ageism, that includes anything that puts one group in some point of privilege above everybody else. Isn't this fun, man? We could go in so many different directions. This is really fun. I'll leave you, my clergy colleagues, with this one thought that'll create some nightmares tonight. And if it does, good. And it's a recent one called After Whiteness. So this is Willie Jennings. And Willie Jennings is a teacher at Yale. He was most recently the dean of Duke Seminary, Duke Divinity School. And he says here, if you want to put a picture around what's got us all messed up, here's your word. It's called successful, self-sufficient white businessman. So in the Western world, so we're going to include Europe and America and Canada, the Western world, for the last 200 plus years, if you're going to be a professional in any particular trade, not just clergy, everything, the sign, the poster child of being really good at it is you look and dress like a successful, self-sufficient white businessman. So now I want to introduce you to Jesus of Nazareth and tell me that there's anything he did or said or represented that is white, successful, self-sufficient business man. No. So in many regards, we've been taught not to speak to this moment, not how to deal with it. What Amy's doing is absolutely something that's got to be created from scratch, because they don't teach us how to do this in seminary, because they weren't taught, and they weren't taught, and they weren't taught. Our whole society's taught all of us who are professionals not to do this work. What we're supposed to do is self-sufficient, successful white businessman stuff. So I'm excited about the work, despite it being hard, because it gets me back to the Jesus we're called to follow.
I absolutely agree with that, Neil. The excitement that I feel, and I've said this from the pulpit, in doing this racial justice work is the closest I've ever felt to understanding and knowing Jesus of Nazareth. So it's joyful, it's uncomfortable, and it's very, very joyful.
Well, Reverend Dr. Amy Gohdes-Luhman and Dr. Reverend Neil Routh, thank you so much for engaging us in very important conversation today. Thank you all to everyone who shared your thoughts and comments with us as together we traveled the road to racial justice, a personal, congregational, and community journey.